Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Jeffersonian Republic. This is Unit 5, and this is part 1 of 3 video PowerPoint lessons that will present the Jeffersonian Republic. Our date range for this unit is 1800 to 1816, and without further ado, here we go. All right, the key idea is this is the big picture. I'm not going to talk about all of these things in this video. I'm only going to focus on part 1, okay? That's the election of 1800. That's the big picture title. So we're going to talk about the Judiciary Act of 1801 and the Midnight Judges. We're going to talk about Marbury v. Madison and judicial review. And we're going to discuss a little bit the end of the Federalists for the most part. And the Federalists are going to pop up a little bit more after the election of 1800, but for the most part, they're pretty much a dead horse. The next video is going to be about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and video number 3 will be about the presidency of James Madison. So the election of 1800 was a very, very big deal. As we should all know by this point, it was the first peaceful transfer of power from one rival party to another. This is very, very important because this was not a common occurrence during this time. Most transfers of power were not peaceful, they were violent and filled with a lot of instability and a lot of chaos, and it was basically a disaster for whatever country was facing it. But with this election, we proved to ourselves and to the world that there was some virtue, that there was a possibility that this great experiment could exist. And of course, this battle took place between Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican, and sitting President John Adams, who was a Federalist. Let's take a look at some maps just to kind of get a visual for what we're looking at. So here you see a map. The title is a presidential election of 1800, but what this really is a map of the Electoral College. And you see how the states are broken down. We have the territories laid out on the left-hand side, but we don't worry about that because since they're not incorporated states, then that means they have nothing to do with the presidential election. You want to look at the 13 states we have in existence at this point. So we have the New England or northern states that are mostly Federalists. If you look at the key at the bottom right, you see that the blue represents Jefferson, the tan, brownish, greenish kind of color represents Adams, and then the states with the stripes are divided. Now, as you should be able to tell by this map, Jefferson definitely cleaned up in this election. He really won a lot more electoral votes than Adams did. Adams, unfortunately, was very well liked in New England where there weren't as many people, but in the South, they had more electoral votes because they did have a pretty large population because of the 3/5 compromise. So I want you to take a look at this map and see the layout. Now, this is also a visual representation of who supported which candidate. You had a lot of farmers and immigrants that were coming into the country, and those people were located primarily in the South, New York as well. Now, if you look at New England, areas that were established, they've been around for a couple hundred years, and their land just wasn't able to produce these mass plantations, this mass farming. Anybody who farmed, they were really subsistence farmers. So there was a lot of shipbuilding, a lot of trade, banking, commerce, things like that that don't really need a lot of labor at this point. So the farmers all voted with Jefferson because the Democratic Republicans were all about agriculture and limited central government, whereas in the North, people were all about strong central government and they were mostly Federalists. So that should explain a little bit of how the election shook out. Now here's another graph for you. We have a bar graph here, and this brings me to a very interesting historical occurrence. We have a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. This tie would not stop here. Obviously, we did break the tie because Jefferson became president, but precisely how he became president is fascinating. Alexander Hamilton, who was actually a Federalist, intervened here, and he didn't want Aaron Burr in office. He would have preferred Jefferson, so he finagled it so that Jefferson would get the votes and Aaron Burr would not win. This would come back to bite him, as you will learn about in video 2. As you can see, poor little John Jay, he's only got 1 electoral vote, and then you have Pinckney, who is the Pinckney from Pinckney's Treaty, and President John Adams, and John Jay from Jay's Treaty as well. So here's a nice bar graph, a nice breakdown of the number of electoral votes and who got what. All right, let's move in to the Supreme Court and get going on Marbury v. Madison. Very, very important stuff. So this guy, John Marshall, he's a Federalist, and he was the Supreme Court Justice at this point. He was nominated by Adams. He was Federalist, so he was appointed by John Adams. He served for a total of 34 years, which means he had a lot of time to make a lot of influential decisions, and he did. most of the decisions that he rendered strengthened the federal government, which makes sense because he was a Federalist. And as we know, they were all about strong central government. Now, arguably his most important case, although as you'll learn later there are many important cases, was Marbury v. Madison that took place in 1803. And the big picture idea you need to know about that is it established judicial review. This is a very, very important concept. It's essential that we understand. So let's move in to Marbury v. Madison, and let me give you some background about this case. So this starts out with the Judiciary Act of 1801. I want you to picture it. You're John Adams. You're sitting in the White House. It's a few months before you're supposed to leave office. You know that you've lost. You've lost the executive. Jefferson's going to come in. And you've lost the legislative. The Democratic Republicans are taking over. You are racking your brain trying to figure out what on earth you're going to be able to do about this because you're about to lose, your party's about to lose all its power. Ooh, let me think. I'll pass through this Judiciary Act of 1801, which it allows me to pack the court. What Adams wanted to do was enable the Federalists to maintain control of at least one branch of government. And in order to do that, he had to increase the number of judgeships so that he could nominate people who were Federalists and pack the court. And that's exactly what he did. So he packed the court full of Federalist judges. And one such gentleman who was supposed to receive his appointment, his name was William Marbury. But because it was a last-minute appointment, Marbury never actually received it. Thomas Jefferson walked in to the president's mansion, and he looked at this appointment, and he looked at James Madison, and he said, listen, we're not delivering this appointment. Adams is out of office. We don't need to worry about it. We're not doing it. Word got out to Marbury that he was supposed to get his appointment, and he wanted it, and he said, you know what? My rights have been violated. And since it was James Madison's job as Secretary of State to deliver that appointment, he sued James Madison, and hence Marbury v. Madison. Now let me break down just a couple of things about this case. There are a few central questions that the court considered which are really important. First, does Marbury have a right to the appointment? And then second, if he does, were his rights actually violated, and can they be remedied or fixed? And if they can the court provide the remedy, or is the court supposed to provide the remedy? Now think about it. Adams is thinking he's got this in the bag. Man, it's a Federalist judge. He put him on the bench. He's like, I got this. I should be all good. So it's looking pretty good at first for Adams. Because does Marbury have a right to the appointment? Oh, yes, he does. If he does, were his rights violated? Can they be remedied? Yes and yes. If so, can the court provide the remedy? No, it can't. Because the act that created his judgeship was unconstitutional. So he had no right to a judgeship at all because it never should have existed, because the act that provided it should not even have been passed in the first place. This is very, very important. This act of declaring the Judiciary Act of 1801 unconstitutional is precisely judicial review. That is the right of the courts to review laws based on their constitutionality and deem them unconstitutional. So that's very, very important. I want to make sure that everyone understands this. Now, we come to the end of the Federalists for the most part. They're going to pop up later on, but I'll talk about that in a little while. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a major problem for the Federalists. They ticked off a lot of people. They cut off a lot of people's rights. So people were really sour on the Federalists. They weren't really in a mood to vote in the direction of John Adams. They burned their bridges at this point because there were so many voters that were coming in that were really going to go with the Democratic Republicans because they agreed with that philosophy. They burned a lot of bridges, the Federalists. What really does them in, as you'll learn about in video number 3, is what they did during and immediately after the War of 1812. That was a major, major boo-boo that the Federalists made, and it was basically going to destroy their party. They continued to pop up a little bit until about the 1820s, but then they're done. You can basically think of the election of 1800 between that point and the 1820s, that they're kind of in a coma. They're a little bit of coma and they're kind of hanging on, but by the 1820s, they pulled the plug and that's it. Whig Party came in for a while and will continue to pop up throughout the next 50 or 60 years or so, but they were brief replacement, but not really major. So I hope this illuminated some of the key ideas from the election of 1800 transitioning into Jefferson's presidency, and I will see you in the next video.